The morning I married Daniel, my grandmother pressed her rosary into my palm and whispered, "Pay attention to who a man is when things don't go his way." I smiled, kissed her cheek, and thought she was just being her usual cautious self. I was 24 years old, standing in a white dress in a small church in Asheville, North Carolina, with sunlight pouring through the stained glass and landing on my bouquet like a blessing. I thought I had everything figured out. I didn't. My name is Rachel Connors. I'm 26 now, and I'm telling you this story because I need you to understand something. The most dangerous thing in my life wasn't the cliff. It wasn't the fall. It wasn't the cold mountain air or the broken bones, or the 3 months I spent recovering in silence. The most dangerous thing was how long I believed that what Daniel showed me on the outside was the same as what lived inside him. Let me take you back to the beginning because none of this makes sense without the before. I grew up in Asheville, small town girl, raised by my mom and my grandmother after my dad left when I was 7. We weren't rich, but we were close. My mom worked as a nurse. My grandmother made the best sweet potato pie you've ever had in your life, and I grew up believing that love was something you built slowly, carefully, the way my grandmother built her garden with patience and attention, and the willingness to pull out anything that wasn't healthy before it took root. I met Daniel Hayes when I was 22. He came into the bookstore where I was working part-time while finishing my communications degree at UNC Asheville. He picked up a copy of a novel I had just finished reading myself, and when I mentioned it, his face lit up in a way that felt completely genuine. We talked for 45 minutes. He bought the book, and 3 others I recommended, and before he left, he asked if he could take me to coffee sometime to discuss them. He was 29 at the time. Handsome in a quiet, steady sort of way, dark brown hair, calm gray eyes, the kind of man who holds doors open without making a production of it. He worked in finance, had a nice apartment on the south side of town, called his mother every Sunday. On paper, he was everything a young woman is taught to look for, and for a long time, he was wonderful. We dated for a year and a half before he proposed. We had disagreements here and there. He could be a little controlling about small things, like how I loaded the dishwasher, or how I spent my weekends, but I chalked it up to him being particular, detail-oriented. A finance brain, I told myself. He just likes order. My mom raised an eyebrow once or twice when he would cut conversations short or speak a little too firmly when he felt I wasn't listening. But I was in love. I had a talent for explaining away anything I didn't want to see. The engagement was beautiful. A dinner in downtown Asheville, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a speech that made me cry. My friends were happy for me. My grandmother hugged me long and tight, and didn't say anything critical, but she kept that same careful look in her eyes that she always had when Daniel's name came up. The wedding was simple and perfect, exactly what I wanted. About 80 guests, a reception at a local vineyard, dancing under string lights until almost midnight. That night, lying in the hotel room, I remember thinking that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The honeymoon was Daniel's idea, a hiking trip to the Smoky Mountains. He had planned the whole thing, which I thought was romantic. I'm not a hardcore outdoors person, but I love nature, and the Smokies have always felt like home to me. We rented a beautiful cabin, and the first 2 days were genuinely perfect. Long hikes, evening fires, meals we cooked together, conversations that felt warm and real. I thought, this is marriage, this is what it's supposed to feel like. On the 3rd day, we set out on a longer trail. It was a clear October morning, cold and bright, with the kind of blue sky that makes you feel like the world is brand new. Daniel was quieter than usual, but I didn't push. He sometimes had moods that needed space, and I had learned to give it to him. About 2 hours into the hike, we reached a viewpoint, a wide rocky ledge that overlooked a steep valley. The view was breathtaking. I walked to the edge to take a photo on my phone, and I remember saying something like, "Daniel, come look at this. It's incredible." And then I felt his hands on my back. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because what happened in those few seconds is still something I process with my therapist on a regular basis. What I can tell you is that I went over the edge of that ledge. I fell. And when I finally stopped falling, caught by a wide ledge about 30 feet down, hidden from the trail above by an overhang of rock, I lay there in pain, stunned, barely able to breathe, and I heard nothing from above. No shouting my name, no sound of scrambling or panic, just silence, and then the sound of footsteps moving away. I don't know how long I lay there. Long enough for the sun to move, long enough to understand that help was not coming from the direction it should have. I had a broken wrist, 2 cracked ribs, a deep cut on my forehead, and more bruises than I could count. My phone was cracked but somehow still functional. I had cell service barely. I called 911, and I remember trying to describe where I was through a voice that kept wanting to shut down from shock. The dispatcher was patient and calm and kept me talking. A search and rescue team reached me about 2 hours later. I was airlifted to a hospital in Knoxville. Now here's where the story shifts, because this is the part that took me months to fully understand. When the hospital staff asked about my emergency contact, and I gave them Daniel's number, they called him. He answered. And according to the nurse who spoke with him, a kind woman named Donna, who later became important to this story, Daniel sounded shocked and relieved. He said he had been looking for me for hours. He said I had wandered off the trail and he had been frantic. He arrived at the hospital within 3 hours, and he held my hand, and he cried. I was on pain medication, I was exhausted and broken and deeply confused, and when Daniel held my hand and wept and said how terrified he had been, some part of my injured, exhausted brain reached for the explanation that hurt less. Maybe I had lost my balance. Maybe I had misread what happened. Maybe the shock had distorted my memory. I spent 4 days in the hospital. Daniel stayed the whole time. He was attentive and gentle and said all the right things. By the time we left, I had almost convinced myself that I didn't know what I knew. Almost. The thing about trauma is that your body keeps the truth even when your mind tries to let it go. At night, I would relive those seconds at the ledge and feel, with absolute certainty, the pressure of 2 hands, flat against my upper back, pushing forward and down. Not a stumble, not a reaction to me losing my balance. A push, deliberate, intentional. But I didn't say anything. I was scared, and I was confused, and I was still telling myself stories about the man I had married 18 days before. We came back to Asheville. Daniel went back to work. I moved slowly through our apartment on pain medication, ribs wrapped, wrist in a cast, trying to figure out what was real. I started noticing things, small things that felt large. The way Daniel would watch me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite name. How he handled all our finances and had, without my noticing, moved most of my personal accounts into joint accounts after the wedding. The life insurance policy he had taken out on me 3 months before the wedding, something I had signed without reading carefully, because he'd told me it was just standard financial planning, something his company recommended for newly married couples. The life insurance policy. I found the paperwork while Daniel was at work, looking for something unrelated in his home office. I sat on the floor of that room for a long time, reading through documents that suddenly told a story I had not wanted to read. $250,000. Beneficiary, Daniel Hayes. I want to be honest with you, my first feeling was not rage. It was grief. Deep, devastating grief, the kind that doesn't make noise because it goes too far down. I had loved this man. I had stood in front of God and my grandmother and my mother and everyone I cared about, and promised my life to him. And he had tried to end that life 18 days later. I called my mother that afternoon. I didn't tell her everything, not yet. I just said I needed to come stay with her for a few days, that I wasn't feeling well. She said, "Come home right now." That's my mom. No questions first. I packed a bag, took photos of every document I could find in that office, and left. When I got to my mother's house, my grandmother was there too, as if she had known to come. I sat down at the kitchen table and told them everything. By the time I finished, my grandmother was holding my hands and my mother was on the phone with her friend Carol, who was a family law attorney. What happened next was not fast. I want to be clear about that, because real life doesn't move the way it does in movies. It was slow and careful and sometimes agonizing. Carol connected me with a criminal defense attorney named Mr. Patterson, who took my case seriously from the first conversation. I gave a formal statement to the Sevier County Sheriff's Office in Tennessee, whose jurisdiction covered the area where I fell. I handed over the insurance documents, the financial records, everything I had photographed. The investigation took almost 2 months. During that time, I stayed with my mother. Daniel called regularly, expressing concern, asking when I was coming home, playing the role of the worried husband. I said very little. I had been advised to keep communication minimal and never confrontational. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, hearing his voice and saying, "I'm okay, I just need more time to recover," while knowing what I knew. I also, with Mr. Patterson's guidance, quietly worked to restore my own financial independence. Carol helped me separate the accounts that had been merged and protect my own assets. It was detailed, unglamorous, important work. The turning point came about 6 weeks into the investigation. Authorities reviewing the case found a witness, a couple from Chattanooga, who had been hiking the same trail that morning, well behind us. They had reached the viewpoint a few minutes after I went over the edge. They had seen Daniel. They reported that he had looked over the edge once, stood still for a moment, and then turned and walked back down the trail, not calling out, not running, not searching, walking. That account, combined with the insurance documents, the financial transfers, and my statement, was enough for the Sevier County Sheriff's Office to open a formal criminal investigation. When Daniel was formally interviewed, his story changed 3 times. By the end of that process, it had become clear enough that charges were recommended. I was not present for his arrest. I was at my mother's house, sitting in the backyard where my grandmother was tending her garden, when Carol called to tell me. I remember I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Okay," and I sat there in the sun for a long time, watching my grandmother work. There's something I need to say here, because I think it matters. When you survive something like this, and the person responsible faces consequences, the feeling isn't triumph. It isn't satisfaction in the way you might expect. What I felt was something quieter and stranger, something more like the way your ears adjust after a very loud sound stops. A slow, spreading quiet. Relief mixed with sadness and a grief that had nowhere to go. I had loved Daniel, or I had loved who I thought he was, and some part of me had to grieve that person, even knowing he had never fully existed. The legal process is still ongoing as I record this. Daniel has pleaded not guilty. I won't speak to the details of active proceedings, but I will say that I have a strong legal team, credible witnesses, and documented evidence, and I trust the process. What I want to talk about, though what I really want to say is what I discovered in the aftermath, because the story's title says I returned alive and discovered the truth, and the truth I discovered wasn't only about Daniel. In the weeks I spent recovering at my mother's house, I had a lot of hours to be still. And I started remembering things that my grandmother had said to me before the wedding, how she had mentioned, once, that she had seen Daniel's name come up in a conversation at her church, something about a difficult end to a previous relationship, a young woman who had been briefly engaged to him, and then broken it off and moved away suddenly, someone from Hendersonville. My grandmother had mentioned it, and I had waved it past me. I started looking, carefully with help. That young woman, I'll call her Melissa, which is not her real name, had ended the engagement abruptly 18 months before Daniel met me. She had left North Carolina entirely. She was living in another state. I reached out through a mutual contact and explained my situation. She called me back the same day. What Melissa told me, slowly and carefully and with the weight of someone who had carried something alone for a long time, was that the engagement had ended because she had found financial documents that didn't add up. An insurance policy taken out on her, transfers she hadn't authorized. She had confronted him, and he had become someone she didn't recognize. She had ended the engagement and left, but she had never reported it because she had no proof of intent, only a financial irregularity. And she had been 23 years old and frightened, and had wanted to simply survive and move on. She cried on the phone. I cried too. We talked for a long time. That conversation more than anything else broke something open for me. Because the truth wasn't just that my husband had tried to hurt me. The truth was that patterns like this don't start with one person. They build up quietly, over time, tested and refined, and they continue until something stops them. I became a part of stopping it. Melissa provided a statement to the investigators. She didn't have to do that. She did it anyway, because she was brave, and because she didn't want there to be a third. I also discovered something about myself in those months that I didn't expect. I had always thought of myself as someone who needed a partner, needed a home, needed the kind of settled life that I associated with security, and what I found in the aftermath living at my mother's house, sleeping in my childhood bedroom, slowly rebuilding, was that I had more foundation than I had known. My mother, my grandmother, old friends who showed up and sat with me and didn't require anything from me. My own mind, which, when I gave it space and stopped filling it with noise, turned out to be clearer and more resilient than I had given it credit for. I started writing. Just for myself at first, processing, making sense, putting the timeline in order. Then more deliberately, I had a communications degree and a story I needed to tell, and slowly those two things started to find each other. I started seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma recovery. Her name is Dr. Andrews, and the work we have done together is the most important work of my adult life. Not dramatic breakthroughs, just the slow, steady work of learning to read your own internal signals accurately. Learning to take what your body knows seriously. Learning that love is not an explanation for everything, and that caring for yourself is not the same as being selfish. 8 months after my honeymoon, I moved into my own apartment for the first time. Small, in a quiet neighborhood not far from my mother's house, with a front window that gets good afternoon light. I arranged my books. I hung pictures I chose myself. I learned how to be alone in a way that felt like fullness rather than absence. My grandmother came over the day I moved in and helped me arrange the kitchen. Before she left, she held my face in her hands the way she used to when I was little and said, "You paid attention, baby. Eventually you paid attention." I told her I wished I had paid attention sooner. She said, "You paid attention when you could. That's enough." I think about that a lot. Here's what I want to say to anyone listening to this story right now, who is somewhere in the middle of their own version of it, maybe not as dramatic as mine, maybe more so. The version where something doesn't feel right but you can't quite name it. The version where you keep choosing the explanation that hurts less. The version where you find yourself constantly adjusting your reality to fit someone else's story about what happened. Your body knows things, your gut knows things. The feeling that wakes you up at 3 in the morning is not anxiety inventing problems, it is your own wisdom trying to get your attention, and you do not have to have proof in order to trust yourself. You do not have to wait until something is undeniable. You are allowed to take yourself seriously much earlier than that. I also want to say this. The people who loved me did not say, "I told you so." Not once. Not my grandmother, who had kept that careful look for years. Not my mother, who had raised an eyebrow at certain moments. Not Carol or Mr. Patterson or Dr. Andrews or any of the people who helped me put my life back together. They simply helped. That kind of love, the kind that shows up without conditions and without agenda, that is what survival actually looks like. Not one dramatic moment, but 100 ordinary moments of someone choosing to be there. I am 26 years old, living in Asheville, North Carolina, in my own apartment with afternoon light and books and a grandmother who calls me every Sunday morning, and a therapist I see every other week, and a life that is genuinely, quietly, profoundly mine. I am not the same person who stood in that church 2 years ago. I am something harder and something softer at the same time, which I didn't know was possible but turns out to be exactly what surviving makes you into. The legal process will run its course. I trust that. I have done everything I am able to do, and now that part is in other people's hands, and I am learning to be at peace with that. What is in my hands is this: my days, my choices, my attention, my life. My grandmother gave me a rosary on my wedding morning and told me to pay attention to who a man is when things don't go his way. I paid attention eventually, later than I should have, earlier than it could have been. And I'm here. That's not nothing, that's everything. If this story reached you today, I hope it gave you something useful, not fear, not despair, but the quiet, steady reminder that you are the most important person in your own story, and your safety, your instincts, and your life are worth fighting for. Even when fighting means simply getting up and leaving, and calling your mother and sitting at a kitchen table, and saying, out loud, what you have been too afraid to say. You don't have to fall off a cliff to take yourself seriously. Take yourself seriously now.